The snow fell gently over Boulder, Colorado. The streets were quiet, lined with Christmas lights that still glowed from the night before. Houses sat still and silent, blanketed in white, holding inside them the warmth of families celebrating the holiday season. Inside one of those homes, a little girl named JonBenét Ramsey had just enjoyed Christmas with her family. She was 6 years old, bright, charming, with golden curls that seemed to catch the light wherever she went. Her parents, John and Patsy Ramsey, had doted on her, along with her older brother Burke. To outsiders, it looked like the perfect American family. A wealthy father, a glamorous mother, a beautiful daughter, and a quiet, reserved son. They had everything: status, comfort, and a home filled with festive cheer. But beneath the glow of Christmas lights, something darker was about to unfold. Something that would shake not just their family but the entire nation. A tragedy that, to this very day, remains one of the most haunting unsolved mysteries in American history. This is the story of JonBenét Ramsey. A story of beauty and innocence, twisted by confusion, suspicion, and unanswered questions. A story where every clue seems to lead in two directions at once. Where truth hides in shadows, and certainty slips away the closer you think you get. And tonight, we revisit that house in Boulder, to follow the chilling path of a case that still has no ending. December 25, 1996. The Ramsey family had spent the day celebrating. They attended a Christmas party at a friend's home, shared laughs, and returned late in the evening. The children were tired. JonBenét had received gifts. Like every little girl her age, she was filled with excitement. Patsy tucked her daughter into bed, the way she always did. A mother's kiss. A whisper of good night. The house fell into silence, the kind of stillness that only winter nights seem to hold. But that silence wouldn't last. Within hours, it would be shattered by a scream. In the early morning of December 26th, Patsy Ramsey awoke before dawn. She planned to prepare for a family trip to Michigan later that day. She walked down the stairs, her robe brushing against the wooden steps. And there, at the bottom of the staircase, she saw it. Piece of paper. No, several pages. A handwritten letter left on the stairs. Her eyes scanned the words. And her breath caught. It was a ransom note. 3 pages long. Strange. Demanding. Plotting. The note claimed JonBenét had been kidnapped. It demanded money. $118,000, an oddly specific amount that nearly matched John Ramsey's work bonus. The writer instructed them not to contact the police. But in shock and desperation, Patsy did just that. At 5:52 a.m., she called 911. Her voice trembled, frantic, barely holding together. Her little girl was gone, she told them. The note was real. The nightmare had begun. Police rushed to the home. They found a house filled with panic, confusion, and friends who had arrived to support the Ramseys. It wasn't a typical crime scene. People came and went. Rooms were touched. Evidence, though no one knew it at the time, was compromised. Officers looked around but saw no clear signs of forced entry. The doors and windows seemed secure. The ransom note, however, loomed large in their minds. Who had written it? Why such an unusual amount of money? Why leave such a long, detailed letter inside the house itself? The morning dragged on, every minute heavier than the last. And then, at around 1 p.m., everything changed. Detective Linda Arndt, one of the officers on the scene, suggested that John Ramsey search the house for anything unusual. It had been hours since the note was found, and no kidnapper had called. John descended into the basement. The air was cold, quiet, ill. He opened a small, cluttered room used for storage. And there, in the dim light, he found her. JonBenét, his little girl. Her body lay motionless. He scooped her up in his arms, crying out in anguish, and carried her upstairs. The scene was heartbreaking. The ransom note, the supposed kidnapping, it was all shattered by this discovery. JonBenét had never left the house. The case was no longer about a ransom. It was about murder. News of the tragedy spread quickly. By evening, television crews gathered outside the Ramsey home. The once quiet Boulder Street became a stage for the nation's newest obsession. Child beauty queen, wealthy parents, a mysterious ransom note, and a murder without clear answers. The media swarmed. Speculation began. And whispers grew louder. Was this the work of a stranger who had broken in during the night? Or was the truth hidden within the very walls of the Ramsey home? From the very first day, investigators faced contradictions. The ransom note seemed strangely written, filled with odd phrases and unnecessary detail. Why would a kidnapper leave such a lengthy message, and then never follow up? The house itself showed no clear evidence of a break-in. The doors were locked, the windows intact. Could someone have slipped inside unnoticed? And then there was the Ramseys themselves. Their reactions, their behavior. To some, they seemed frantic and heartbroken. To others, something felt off. Every detail of that morning, every tear, every word, would be analyzed under a microscope. And in the process, the line between grief and guilt became blurred. The murder of JonBenét Ramsey was not just a crime. It was a mystery that seemed designed to confuse. Every piece of evidence seemed to contradict another. Every theory seemed to unravel just when it looked convincing. Was it an intruder who slipped in through the basement window, leaving chaos in their wake? Or was it someone inside the home, someone who staged the scene, leaving behind the ransom note as a distraction? Police leaned one way. The media leaned another. And the public? They were torn down the middle. JonBenét's story was no longer just about a little girl. It was about suspicion, about trust, about the uncomfortable idea that sometimes the answers we seek are not the ones we want to hear. And so, from that cold December morning in 1996, the mystery began. A mystery that has endured for decades. And one that still, to this day, refuses to be solved. The investigation began with chaos. The Boulder Police Department was not prepared for a case of this magnitude. Their town was quiet, far from the kind of high-profile crimes that dominated big cities. But suddenly, they were at the center of the nation's attention. The first mistake had already been made. The house, filled with friends, neighbors, and family members that morning, was no longer a clean crime scene. Crucial evidence may have been lost forever in those first few hours. Detectives focused immediately on the ransom note. It was long, unusually long for a supposed kidnapper. Almost 3 pages of handwritten words. It addressed John Ramsey by name. It used strange phrases, as if copied from movies or novels. And it ended with a chilling warning not to involve the police, something Patsy had already done. Handwriting experts were brought in. The note was compared against samples from both John and Patsy. The conclusion was murky. Some said it was possible that Patsy could have written it, though the evidence wasn't strong enough to be certain. Others dismissed that idea, claiming the style didn't match at all. Meanwhile, detectives turned their eyes to the basement. The window there was broken, but investigators couldn't agree whether it was from a break-in or simply damaged earlier. There were no clear footprints in the snow outside the house. No obvious signs of an intruder forcing their way inside. The case was already splitting into 2 paths. One theory pointed to a stranger who entered the house that night. The other suggested something far more unsettling, that someone inside the home knew what had happened. The media wasted no time in seizing the story. Headlines screamed across newspapers. Television anchors spoke in hushed, serious tones. A little girl, famous for her pageant appearances, had been murdered in her own home on Christmas night. It was unthinkable, and yet the entire country couldn't look away. Reporters flooded Boulder. Cameras camped outside the Ramsey house. Every move the family made was watched, analyzed, and dissected. They became unwilling participants in a national spectacle. At first, the sympathy was overwhelming. A grieving mother, a devastated father, an older brother suddenly thrust into the shadows of tragedy. But sympathy soon gave way to suspicion. Patsy's 911 call was replayed over and over. Her tone was studied. Her words were pulled apart. Some claimed she sounded too rehearsed, too dramatic. Others argued she sounded exactly like a panicked mother would. John's behavior was also questioned. Why had he carried JonBenét's body upstairs instead of leaving her in place for investigators? Was it the act of a heartbroken father, or a man trying to control the scene? Even Burke, just 9 years old at the time, became the subject of speculation. Why had he been so quiet? Why had police kept him away from interviews in the early stages? The public began whispering, pointing fingers, trying to solve the puzzle themselves. For investigators, the tension only grew worse. Some detectives were convinced the Ramseys knew more than they were admitting. Others believed the evidence pointed outward, that a predator had somehow slipped into the home. The division within the police force made progress nearly impossible. Then came the interviews. John and Patsy sat down with authorities, but their cooperation was complicated. They hired lawyers almost immediately. They refused certain requests, citing the need to protect themselves from false accusations. To some, this looked like guilt. To others, it looked like self-preservation in the face of a relentless media circus. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and still no arrest was made. Theories spread like wildfire. Some pointed to the world of pageants. JonBenét had been in the spotlight, adored by audiences but also visible to strangers. Could someone from outside the family, someone obsessed with her, have taken advantage of that visibility? Others looked inward. The note, the lack of forced entry, the behavior of the family, it all felt too suspicious. Whispers grew into accusations. The once sympathetic public began to turn. Tabloids ran stories that painted Patsy as controlling, desperate to keep her daughter in the pageant world. Rumors suggested conflicts inside the home. Nothing was proven, but everything was speculated. The Ramseys, feeling under siege, made public appearances to defend themselves. They went on television, insisting they were innocent. They spoke of their grief, their pain, their desire for answers. But every word seemed to feed the fire instead of extinguishing it. The ransom note remained one of the strangest elements of all. Why ask for such a specific amount of money? Why leave the note inside the house, rather than make a phone call or send a letter? Why never follow up? Seemed staged. But staged by whom? Investigators tested handwriting samples, DNA evidence, fibers from clothing, footprints, every detail they could find. Yet each test led to more confusion. The DNA evidence found on JonBenét's clothing didn't match John, Patsy, or Burke. To many, this was proof of an intruder. But skeptics argued that the DNA could have been transferred from another source, unrelated to the crime. Nothing was clear. Every clue seemed to bend in two directions. Every discovery raised new questions instead of providing answers. By the end of 1997, the case had stalled. The Ramseys were formally named as possible suspects, but no charges were ever filed. The evidence wasn't strong enough, the contradictions too many. Meanwhile, the media continued to feed on the tragedy. JonBenét's photographs, often from her pageant competitions, were everywhere. Her bright smile, her elaborate costumes, became symbols of innocence lost. But they also fueled criticism, with some questioning why such a young child had been placed in the spotlight at all. The tragedy was no longer just about a crime. It had become a conversation about beauty, fame, privilege, and the darkness that sometimes hides behind perfect appearances. The Ramseys lived under a shadow. Everywhere they went, eyes followed. Whispers chased them through grocery stores, airports, even church pews. They were parents in mourning, but also suspects in the eyes of millions. And still, through it all, JonBenét's voice was silent. Her story, her truth, remained locked away. Somewhere, hidden in the details of that night, was the answer. But year after year, the answer refused to come. The case had slipped into something far larger than Boulder, larger than Colorado, larger even than the Ramsey family itself. It had become a national obsession. And like all obsessions, it demanded resolution. But resolution never arrived. The questions only grew louder. Who wrote the note? Who entered the basement? Who silenced a 6-year-old girl on Christmas night? Decades later, those questions still echo, and the answers remain out of reach. The new year arrived, but the case showed no sign of resolution. The Ramsey home remained under scrutiny, the family trapped inside a storm they could not escape. Investigators, journalists, and armchair detectives all searched for answers, but the more they searched, the more tangled the web became. The media had turned the story into daily entertainment. Television specials aired in prime time. Tabloids sold record numbers of copies, each one promising new revelations. Every detail of the family's life was exposed. What they ate, where they traveled, how they spoke, even the way they decorated their home. The tragedy became a mirror for the public's curiosity and judgment. Everyone seemed to have an opinion. Some believed the Ramseys were hiding something terrible. Others believed they were victims not only of a crime, but also of a relentless witch hunt. The ransom note continued to puzzle experts. It was too long, too theatrical. The phrase, "we are a small foreign faction," baffled investigators. What did it mean? Was it an intentional attempt to mislead, or simply nonsense scribbled to confuse? The handwriting analysis was revisited again and again. Some examiners thought Patsy's writing bore similarities to the note. Others dismissed that claim, arguing it wasn't close enough. No consensus could be reached. Meanwhile, the DNA evidence became both the strongest lead and the greatest frustration. It suggested that someone outside the family might have been responsible. But the sample was partial, incomplete. It wasn't enough to identify a suspect with certainty. Outside of the house, attention turned to possible intruders. One theory suggested that a stranger obsessed with JonBenét had entered the home. Her pageant appearances had placed her in the public eye. Photographs of her had been printed in magazines and broadcast on television. Could someone have targeted her because of that exposure? Police looked at registered sex offenders in the area. They interviewed neighbors, acquaintances, anyone who might have crossed paths with the Ramseys. But each lead seemed to dry up. Nothing concrete emerged. The story grew darker in the public imagination. Television dramas borrowed elements of the case for fictional episodes. Books were written, each claiming to hold the key to the mystery. But with every new theory, the truth seemed to slip further away. Inside the Ramsey household, grief was constant. Patsy, in particular, struggled under the weight of suspicion. She was portrayed as demanding, as controlling, as obsessed with JonBenét's pageants. To many, she seemed the easiest target for blame. But no evidence proved she had done anything. John, on the other hand, was seen as distant, as calm in ways that unsettled some observers. Critics wondered if his composure masked something deeper. Supporters insisted it was simply his way of coping. Anne Burke, just a child, remained silent. Protected from the media, shielded from public questioning. Yet whispers surrounded him too. Could jealousy or anger have played a role? It seemed unthinkable, but the public appetite for answers spared no one. As the months turned into years, the investigation shifted again. The district attorney's office took a cautious stance. The police wanted to push harder on the Ramseys, but the DA hesitated. There wasn't enough evidence. The risk of wrongful prosecution loomed large. In 1999, a grand jury was convened to consider the case. For months, evidence was presented behind closed doors. The public waited, expecting a decision that might finally bring clarity. But the outcome only deepened the mystery. The grand jury recommended indicting John and Patsy on charges related to the death of their daughter. Yet the district attorney declined to move forward. He argued that the evidence wasn't strong enough to secure a conviction. Without a trial, without a chance to test the evidence in court, the case remained suspended in limbo. The Ramseys, once again, were left in a cruel space, publicly doubted but legally untouched. They gave interviews, wrote books, tried to defend themselves. But the shadow of suspicion never left. Over time, attention turned to other potential suspects. One name that surfaced was that of a local man with a troubled past, known for his erratic behavior. Another was a drifter who had been seen near the Ramsey home in the days before Christmas. Each seemed promising at first, but none could be tied directly to the crime. Then came the most bizarre twist of all. In 2006, nearly a decade after the crime, a man named John Mark Carr confessed to the murder. He claimed he had been present in the house that night, that he had been responsible. The confession made headlines worldwide. Was the mystery finally solved? But almost immediately, doubts arose. Carr's story was inconsistent. Details didn't match. And most importantly, his DNA did not match the sample found at the scene. The confession collapsed under its own weight. It was another dead end, another cruel reminder that the truth was still out of reach. Meanwhile, the Ramseys tried to hold on to normalcy. They moved away from Boulder, seeking peace that never came. They raised their surviving son, hoping he could live without the burden of endless speculation. But the past followed them. Every new anniversary of JonBenét's death brought renewed media attention. Documentaries, interviews, and retrospectives reopened old wounds. The case never truly left the headlines. Patsy Ramsey battled cancer for years. She died in 2006, never knowing who had taken her daughter's life, never clearing her name in the eyes of everyone. John carried on, quieter, older, still marked by the tragedy. Through all of this, JonBenét remained frozen in time. Forever 6 years old. Forever smiling in photographs. Forever the subject of a case that refused to be solved. The case had become more than a mystery. It had become a symbol of the flaws in the justice system, a symbol of the dangers of media frenzy, a symbol of how easily truth can be lost when buried beneath speculation and suspicion. And yet, despite everything, there was still a sense of hope. Hope that one day, a breakthrough in science or technology would reveal what had been hidden. Hope that someone, somewhere, would finally step forward with the truth. Hope that JonBenét's story might one day have an ending. For now, though, it remained only questions. Questions that haunted investigators. Questions that haunted the public. Questions that haunted a family torn apart by tragedy. Who was in the house that night? Who wrote the note? Who silenced a little girl, leaving behind a mystery that would endure for decades? The answers remained in the dark. And the world, still watching, still wondering, waited for light that never seemed to come. Time passed, but the shadow of that night never lifted. The house in Boulder became infamous, a landmark for tragedy rather than a home. People drove by, staring at its walls, as if the answers might somehow be written on the bricks. But the walls remained silent, just as silent as the little girl who once lived inside. As years slipped into decades, the case evolved alongside advances in science. New DNA techniques promised breakthroughs. Samples from JonBenét's clothing were retested. And each time, investigators hoped that the technology might finally reveal what had been hidden in 1996. The results were complicated. Traces of DNA from an unknown male were detected, fueling the intruder theory. Supporters of this idea argued that it cleared the Ramseys, pointing instead to someone outside the family. But skeptics remained. They argued the samples could have been contaminated, or transferred from manufacturing, packaging, or handling. Nothing was definitive. Despite the uncertainty, the presence of that unidentified DNA forced investigators to look beyond the family once more. Lists of potential suspects grew. Each name came with a story, each story with its own twists. Some were neighbors, some were drifters, some were strangers with troubling pasts. But none could be tied directly to the crime. The passage of time made the investigation even harder. Memories faded. Witnesses moved away. Evidence degraded. What once might have been a strong lead dissolved into speculation. The media never let the story go. Every anniversary brought new specials, new documentaries, new debates. Television networks replayed the 911 call, showed photographs of the ransom note, and revisited every detail of the timeline. For viewers, it became a ritual. For the Ramsey family, it was a wound reopened again and again. Patsy's death in 2006 left John and Burke alone with the weight of suspicion. For John, it was a double grief, the loss of his wife and the unresolved loss of his daughter. For Burke, it was a childhood spent under a cloud he never asked for. He rarely spoke publicly, preferring silence, until years later when he gave a rare interview. Even then, his words were dissected, his expressions analyzed, as if the truth might be hidden in the way he smiled or shifted in his chair. The public's obsession with the case never faded. People debated in forums, in coffee shops, in living rooms late at night. Everyone had a theory. Everyone thought they knew what happened. Some pointed to the family, others to a shadowy intruder, still others to theories even stranger. Books continued to pour out, written by investigators, journalists, even private detectives who claimed to have uncovered new evidence. But each new publication only deepened the divide. One book insisted the parents were responsible. Another declared their innocence and pointed to outside suspects. None provided the definitive proof needed to close the case. At times, the investigation itself became the story. The feud between the Boulder Police Department and the district attorney's office spilled into public view. Each side accused the other of mishandling the case. Finger-pointing replaced progress. And the case became stuck in a limbo from which it has never escaped. For the public, the frustration was immense. This wasn't just another cold case. This was JonBenét Ramsey, the 6-year-old whose face had become instantly recognizable. How could a case so famous remain unsolved? How could the truth remain so carefully hidden? The house meanwhile changed hands. New families moved in, attempting to create lives within walls that carried so much history. But for many, the thought of living there was unbearable. It wasn't just a house. It was a reminder of a mystery that still haunted the nation. Over time, new suspects came and went. One man was investigated after being caught with disturbing materials. Another, a teacher, was briefly considered after suspicious comments, but he was quickly cleared. Each time, headlines flared with the promise of resolution, and each time, the case returned to silence. The internet gave the mystery a new home. Forums dedicated entire sections to debating the case. Amateur sleuths pored over police reports, autopsy findings, photographs of the ransom note. Theories multiplied, each as detailed as the last. Some were logical, others outlandish. But all were born from the same frustration, the feeling that justice had never been served. For John Ramsey, life moved forward, but the past never released him. He remarried, sought moments of peace, but interviews revealed the same sadness in his voice. He wanted answers. He wanted closure. But year after year, the case remained frozen, just like his daughter in those photographs. Burke grew into adulthood. His childhood defined by silence. When he finally spoke on national television, many expected clarity. Instead, his interview only added to the mystery. Some viewers thought he seemed nervous, evasive. Others believed he was simply uncomfortable reliving trauma. No matter what he said, it seemed the public had already decided what they wanted to believe. The case became more than a tragedy. It became a cultural phenomenon. It appeared in documentaries, podcasts, films, even music. JonBenét's name became shorthand for mystery, for suspicion, for the kind of story that never truly ends. And still, the central questions lingered, unchanged since that winter morning in 1996. Who wrote the note? Who left the basement door unlocked? Who ended the life of a 6-year-old girl whose only crime was being too young to protect herself? Advances in technology offered hope. New DNA methods, new forensic tools, new investigative techniques. Each development brought with it renewed promises that the case could be solved. Yet, as of today, those promises remain unfulfilled. The Ramsey case is not just a story of loss. It is a story of failure. Failure of police to protect the crime scene. Failure of investigators to work together. Failure of the system to separate fact from speculation. And through all of it, the one person who mattered most, JonBenét, was lost in the noise. Her life, short as it was, is often overshadowed by the mystery of her death. But she was more than a case, more than a headline, more than a face on the evening news. She was a child who loved to sing, to dress up, to smile for the camera. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. And she deserved more than to be remembered only for a mystery. Yet mysteries have a way of consuming everything around them. And for JonBenét, the truth remains locked away. Somewhere, perhaps in evidence boxes still sitting in police storage. Perhaps in the memory of someone who has remained silent all these years. Or perhaps in a detail so small it has been overlooked again and again. The case remains open. Detectives still speak of it, still review it, still chase the hope of resolution. But time is the greatest enemy. And with each passing year, the chances grow slimmer. Still hope lingers. Because mysteries this large, this haunting, never fully fade. They remain alive, carried forward by those who refuse to forget. And JonBenét's story is one the world has never forgotten. 2 decades had passed, yet the name JonBenét Ramsey was still etched into America's collective memory. Most cases fade with time. Details blur, witnesses vanish, and public interest shifts to newer stories. But this case refused to fade. Every anniversary brought her name back into headlines, reminding everyone that justice had never been served. The cultural impact was undeniable. True crime shows built entire episodes around the case. Podcasts dissected every second of the timeline. Newspapers continued to print retrospectives, asking the same questions that had haunted investigators since 1996. Even those too young to remember the original events knew her name. JonBenét had become a symbol of unanswered questions. The obsession went beyond media. Ordinary people became detectives from their living rooms. They studied grainy photos of the basement. They replayed the 911 call, analyzing tone, pauses, even breaths. They debated handwriting samples, comparing them with charts and guides they found online. The case had turned into a puzzle the entire world wanted to solve. But no matter how many eyes studied the details, the answers remained hidden. The ransom note still stood as one of the strangest pieces of evidence in criminal history. Its length, its bizarre phrases, its theatrical tone, it baffled experts and amateurs alike. Some believed it was a deliberate distraction. Others believed it revealed the writer's desperation, or even their identity. But to this day, no one has proven who wrote it. Advances in DNA technology provided occasional sparks of hope. Forensic science was far ahead of where it had been in 1996. Cold cases across the country were being solved through new methods, often by matching DNA from crime scenes with public databases. It seemed only a matter of time before JonBenét's case would follow. Investigators quietly submitted her case for re-examination using these new techniques. The unknown male DNA sample remained the focus. If it could be matched to someone in a database, the mystery might finally be cracked open. But the results, so far, have remained frustratingly inconclusive. The partial sample was too fragile, too small, to provide the certainty investigators needed. And so the waiting continued. Meanwhile, the story of JonBenét continued to divide public opinion. Some believed with absolute certainty that an intruder had been responsible. Others believed, just as firmly, that the answers lay inside the Ramsey home. Each side pointed to evidence that supported their view, and dismissed what didn't. The debate became less about finding truth, and more about defending beliefs. In recent years, documentaries have tried to bring new clarity. Some presented fresh theories, others revisited old ones. One group of experts even staged elaborate reconstructions of the crime scene, trying to test what could or couldn't have happened that night. But even with new perspectives, the ending was always the same: uncertainty. For John Ramsey, life became quieter as the years went on. He remarried, built a life away from the spotlight, but he never stopped speaking about his daughter. In interviews, he remained calm but weary. He wanted the world to remember JonBenét as more than a headline. He wanted her remembered for her smile, her laughter, the joy she brought in her short life. Burke, after years of silence, finally appeared in public as an adult. When he gave a rare television interview, it was meant to clear the air. Instead, it only added fuel to the fire. His awkward mannerisms, his unusual expressions, were dissected endlessly. Was he hiding something, people asked? Or was he simply a private man uncomfortable under the glare of cameras? Once again, no answers. Only more speculation. Through it all, JonBenét's story became a lesson in the dangers of obsession. The public's hunger for answers blurred the line between fact and rumor. Accusations were treated as evidence. Speculation became reality in the minds of many. And somewhere, in the middle of all that noise, the truth was lost. But the case also became a symbol of persistence. For investigators who refused to close the file. For scientists who continued to refine DNA analysis, hoping one day the sample would yield results. And for ordinary people who still believed that the mystery could be solved. Every few years, whispers of a breakthrough appear. Talk of retesting evidence. Talk of new suspects. Talk of possible arrests. Each time, the whispers fade into silence, but the hope never fully disappears. The story remains powerful because it touches something deeper than just crime. It is the story of innocence lost, of a child taken too soon, of a family destroyed by tragedy and suspicion. It is a story about trust. Trust in justice, trust in truth, trust in the systems meant to protect us. And it is a story about how easily that trust can shatter. JonBenét's case also forced America to confront uncomfortable realities. The world of child pageants came under scrutiny, with critics questioning the pressures placed on children and the exposure it created. The media's role in amplifying tragedy was questioned too. Did the relentless coverage help keep the case alive, or did it distort it beyond recognition? These questions remain as unsettled as the case itself. And yet, behind all of that debate is the simple image of a little girl, smiling on stage, holding flowers, dressed in costumes that seemed too big for her age, but glowing with the kind of innocence only a child can carry. Her story is tragic not only because of how it ended, but because of how it has been remembered. Frozen in speculation, trapped in theories, her voice drowned out by arguments she never asked for. As the decades pass, the case may one day find resolution. Perhaps technology will finally catch up. Perhaps someone will break their silence. Perhaps the truth will emerge when least expected. Until then, JonBenét Ramsey remains a name without closure, a story without an ending, a mystery that has outlived the century it began in. And the world, still waiting, still watching, wonders if the day will ever come when the final chapter can finally be written. The story of JonBenét Ramsey is more than a case file. It is more than fingerprints, ransom notes, or timelines. It is a story that speaks to the fragility of innocence, and to the way tragedy can ripple far beyond a single family. For nearly 3 decades, her name has lingered in headlines. Not because of who she was in life, but because of the mystery that surrounds her death. And that is perhaps the greatest tragedy of all. JonBenét was a child, full of laughter, dreams, and the boundless energy of youth. Her life was not meant to be remembered only as a question without an answer. But questions are what remain. Who slipped into that house on Christmas night, if anyone did? Who penned the words of the ransom note, left so carefully on the staircase? Who silenced a 6-year-old girl, leaving her forever frozen in time? These questions echo year after year, haunting investigators, haunting the public, haunting anyone who dares to look too closely. The truth may be buried in evidence boxes, in DNA samples, or in the memory of someone who has stayed quiet all this time. It may one day surface, when science finally pushes past today's limits. Or it may remain locked away forever, hidden by the mistakes of that first chaotic morning. And so the world waits for resolution, waits for justice, waits for an ending to a story that has gone on far too long. Until then, the name JonBenét Ramsey will continue to stand as a symbol of innocence lost, a symbol of unanswered questions, a symbol of how tragedy can outlive the moment it was born. But beyond all of that, she should be remembered for something more. Not as a mystery, not as a headline, but as a child who deserved to grow up, to chase dreams, to live a life far longer than the one she was given. And so, as we close this story tonight, we return to that quiet house in Boulder, Colorado. The snow still falls in memory, soft and silent. The Christmas lights still glow faintly in the distance. And somewhere, the laughter of a little girl still lingers, like an echo caught between time and memory. JonBenét Ramsey's story may not yet have an ending, but her name endures. Her light endures. And one day perhaps the truth will too.